Hi, camp followers. Thanks for joining us this evening. I know it's been a pretty rubbish week with everything else that's been going on in the world, but we're going to bring you a little bit of light this evening with a really interesting topic about canine conditioning and home exercise programs. So we have got Nikki and Katie, who I'm going to let them introduce themselves a little bit because they both do slightly different things, and then they do something together, which is really interesting. It's going to be something that I think a lot of you are going to want to know about. So welcome, Nikki. Welcome, Katie. I'm going to hand straight over to you and to introduce yourselves, and then we'll start on what we're going to talk about. So, Nikki, would you like to go first about what your role is?
So I'm a veterinary physiotherapist and canine hydrotherapist, working mainly in clinic, and along with Katie and two other very highly qualified and clever ladies, Alex and Kirsti, we run Conditioning Your Canine, which is an online platform for exercises, exercise videos that therapists can set up and show owners how to do conditioning exercises at home. So that's the resource that we work on together with Alex and Kirsti as well.
Perfect. Katie?
So I trained as a physio and hydrotherapist as well, and used to work in clinic with Nikki, but currently I'm not in clinical work, but I do the CYC platform, like she said, and work alongside Kirsti and Alex on this great program that allows you to build bespoke home exercise programs.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's going to be so popular. We were talking about it before, and just talking about, through COVID, that so many of us have had to branch out and adapt our businesses to try and provide other services that actually are still thriving now that COVID is hopefully disappearing. And it's just a new way of doing things, but also an opportunity to provide something new, and I think something that's going to be really important and really useful for a lot of people. So we're going to talk this evening about canine conditioning, but more specifically about the home exercise programs. So I was saying earlier, when Nikki and Katie initially emailed about what we're going to talk about, they'd put we're going to talk about HEPs. And I was thinking, is this some brand new disease condition that I need to know about, some arthritic thing that I've never heard of before? So if we do talk about HEPs, or it comes up as HEPs, it's standing for home exercise programs. But we'll try and call them that as we go through. But shall we just talk a little bit about what home exercise programs are and why they're so important, especially for arthritic dogs?
Sure. So your home exercise program is one of your components to your sort of therapy toolbox in terms of the sorts of things that you can put in place to help achieve your rehab goals. So alongside all of your physiotherapy and your hydrotherapy, your massage techniques, your electrotherapies, and the home adjustments, and making sure your dog is doing appropriate exercise, the sort of level of exercise they're doing. Your home exercise program is what allows you to continue that therapeutic input in between your treatment sessions. So if you were just to focus on the sort of progress that you could make in your therapy sessions alone, you would be limited in how much progress you could make, because you've just got this window of your session time to have that therapeutic input. And it's what happens on a day-to-day basis that can be so important as to whether your dog is maintaining or making progress, or potentially actually there's sort of more things going on in the background that are, they're just rebuilding the same tension patterns and the same sort of compensatory strategies. So when we think about putting together a home exercise program, we want to look at how we would re-educate a gait pattern, how we would try and encourage functional movement patterns, how we would help to create correct and balanced muscle recruitment, and the sort of the speed and balance of the recruitment of agonist and antagonist pairs, how those muscles work together to make that smooth and correct movement, and also looking at how we would engage the deep stabilizing musculature, those postural muscles, which are that foundation of balanced movement. We'd also look at how we could influence the proprioceptive system, so the body's ability to be aware of where it or a limb or a joint is in space, how we would start to re-establish and tune that back up again. Lots of conditions like arthritis are very damaging to your ability to be aware of where you're putting your paws, and then how we would look at developing that and improving further, and any specific deficits we have. So that might be related to the condition, the diagnosis that dog has, maybe their level of fitness, maybe the conditioning aims that you have generally, or if that dog has a particular job. So if they are an agility dog or a working dog. And then when you think about how you would choose which exercises you would use to piece that together and to try and influence those components, you need to think about what's going to be targeted and appropriate for your dog and your owner. So you need to bear in mind the challenges and the requirements that the individual dog has, and that's both sort of behaviorally what they can cope with, what level of sort of tasks and challenges you can set them, and physically what they're going to be capable of and what they're going to be able to achieve. And because every dog is an individual, obviously you've got to think of that on an individual basis. So no two home exercise programs are going to be exactly the same, even if you're dealing with two dogs with the same condition or the same breed, even the same age. So the other thing that you would want to think about as well is what does your owner need, and what are their limitations potentially. So you know, how much time have they got to be able to do a home exercise program? What access to equipment have they got? Or do you need to think about what sort of equipment you might be able to kind of almost build out of what they've got in the house, or what they can access when they go for a walk? And maybe whether they have any mobility sort of issues themselves that might mean that things like getting down on the floor and doing paw placement isn't going to be appropriate. So you've got to think about all of those things together so that you can set both your dog and your owner up as a team to succeed in the home exercise program that you put together.
And I guess it's kind of what the expectation of the end result is as well, isn't it? Because in like an arthritic dog, for example, we're not planning on getting them back to agility. We're just trying to maintain and help encourage a good movement, so that you're putting less strain on the rest of the body. Whereas I don't know, but would there be younger dogs where they don't have any conditions, any joint disease, but they're wanting to do a conditioning in advance to try and help prevent the development of arthritis?
I think we would probably argue that every dog can, benefit hugely from a conditioning program, no matter, what level they're at, what level of fitness they're at, and even especially the sort of dogs competing at high level agility will have bespoke conditioning exercises which will focus on their specific needs and goals, and also what they're having to deal with in their athletic career. But then also, dogs who are companion animals, who are just enjoying a relaxing life at home, the same thing. They need to be able to, like with us, our posture is so important in how we move and how we use our bodies. And dogs are no different. And certainly in terms of injury prevention, it can be hugely helpful to have a dog that's got a very good proprioceptive system, that knows how to use itself properly, whose muscles are all working in, as Katie said, in a balanced and correct manner. That's really going to sort of future-proof you for injury and issues further down the line. Yeah,
because I think with a lot of younger dogs, they may have underlying joint disease, but it doesn't become apparent until later on in life. And it may not become apparent even until later if they were to undergo some sort of conditioning to try and not mask the symptoms, but manage them before they became a problem and then had to be diagnosed.
And I think it can also show things up. So, if your dog's just going out on nice walks and having sort of, as I say, sort of a relaxing life at home as a companion animal, you won't necessarily know that they can't do something because they won't show you that. And it's often when we put dogs in a situation where they ask them to do a very specific task, and you suddenly realize they can do that with their left foot, but they can't do it with their right. And I wonder why. And it can sometimes actually show up imbalances in the way that they move themselves and in their biomechanics that you might not have picked up on previously.
Yeah, totally. I mean, we've had plenty of lives before about mobility and gait. And when you spend all day looking at dogs, you appreciate what's a good gait and what's not such a good gait. But I think if you've never had a dog before and you suddenly get one and it doesn't have a great gait, you don't necessarily appreciate that until you get somebody to look at it with you. But as soon as it's pointed out, like you say, if you challenge them in the right way, where you're looking at something specifically, it becomes apparent.
Yeah.
And yeah, absolutely, I agree. Canine conditioning, just to look at that kind of thing, even in a dog that you don't think has an issue, is the best time to start, because then you're going to appreciate any changes and issues. Yeah. So how do you start when you've got a dog that comes to you, whether it's got an issue or not? What's your starting point? How do you decide what you're going to do?
So, so we would make a thorough assessment of that dog first. So we would speak to the owner and take a history. We would watch them move, and we would watch them in static postures. And then what can be really helpful is even just watching them have a bit of a mooch around the consult room. So that kind of time when they're not necessarily being asked to do anything, when they've maybe relaxed a little bit and they're just having a bit of a snuffle around, sometimes you will notice changes in posture or little shifting weight patterns, and maybe they're a little bit up on their toe. They haven't really got their pad to the floor on one limb. So you might see some of those subtle little things, which, especially if you've got something quite young and bouncy, things like on a gait assessment might be quite hard to pick up.
Yeah.
And then you would do your manual assessment. So again, working with what your dog can cope with. Some dogs can't cope with being hands-on straight away, so you'll try and take as much information from what you can observe and what you can gain from your owner as possible. But if they're comfortable with you having contact, then you would do as much sort of palpation assessment and maybe some range of motion assessment as you can, maybe trying to use some active facilitated techniques to assess range of motion so that you can see what they're happy to offer you.
What do you mean by that?
So things like asking a dog for a paw, to have a look at where they maybe seem restricted through their elbow or the shoulder, or even through their carpi, their little wrist joints, rather than potentially on that sort of initial assessment going straight into passive range of motion. Some dogs will cope with that, but other dogs would find that quite full on. And you might actually end up getting more bracing and more reluctance and possibly a little bit of a negative association, a bit of anxiety, rather than being able to read the sort of the true situation. So we would always try and kind of ease into it a little bit more gently, I guess.
Those kind of movement patterns also tell you a huge amount about how the dog uses their whole body, because often if you ask them for a paw and sit, they'll like fall over onto one hip because they haven't got the core stability to be able. So it might not be a shoulder or an elbow issue. It might actually be a spinal or a pelvic issue, but they can't maintain that positioning. And we get quite obsessive at Conditioning Your Canine about good form, and about how, all the movements that we ask dogs to do in the program and through the videos that we prescribe to owners is about, is your dog able to do this movement in good form? And that's the kind of key to success in a home exercise program, really. And as I say, it's why we get a bit obsessive about it. And we have loads of resources on the program to make sure that people are aware of what does good form look like in a sit? What does good form look like in the stand? What am I actually looking for as a correct functional movement pattern? Yeah. And that's what we're trying to achieve all the time.
Absolutely.
I think it's really interesting, actually, because what you were saying, Katie, is something that I noticed quite a lot, and I'm sure lots of vets and nurses do when they're doing palpations, hands-on examinations. When you go to, and owners will often comment as well, so when you go to do a range of movements that you're under control of, the dog will tense up and say, no, I don't want to do that. And it's really difficult to assess whether there is a pain there or whether they just don't want you to do that. They're not in the mood for it. So if you can find something like you've said, where it's a voluntary movement and you're asking them, do you want to do this? Yes, I'm going to give you my paw. Then it's much better to assess it like that, isn't it? Than when you're trying to force them to do something.
Absolutely. And then, like Nikki says, you can look at it globally. So, okay, maybe you've got some information about that forelimb, but you've possibly also got some information about their core, and about how well they can maintain a sit and how they transfer their weight and what sort of things they might be trying to avoid. So you can take an awful lot from something that is a relatively small request from that dog, and is a bit less invasive. Yeah.
No, it's really good. A good point. So if you were to start, then you've done your initial assessment And what kind of videos would you ask people to bring in if you want to watch a dog move? What movements are you asking for?
So again, as Katie said, like often the kind of mooching around at home videos can be really helpful. The other thing that you get when you have that kind of video is you can really see what the home environment is like. So really slippery floors. I've had videos of dogs sliding towards the camera across tiles, and you're like, okay, right, we need to get on top of this.
Yeah.
But in terms of movement, it can be, something quite kind of innocuous day-to-day movement patterns. Sits are very telling, particularly sits on a nice non-slip surface, because how a dog sits can often tell you a huge amount about its core mobility and also sort of pelvic limb mobility as well. And then out on walks, it's often very useful to see the dog sort of walking straight away from you, to see muscle balance and loading of the pelvic limbs, and then straight towards you for the thoracic limb. But often, as Katie said, we gain a huge amount of information from just watching the dog just sort of do its thing, because then when they're relaxed, they don't feel like they've got eyes on them. And if a dog is nervous and thinks that everyone's watching it, they're not necessarily going to behave in a natural manner. So that kind of natural movement pattern is really valuable.
Yeah. And then Katie was also saying about thinking about at the beginning what is going to be available to the owner and to the dog, and what's achievable. So what sort of things are we talking about? What might we need?
So this is hugely important, because as therapists and as vets, I think it's really our responsibility to make sure that whatever we recommend to the owner, they can actually achieve that, so that you set your owner and your dog up to achieve. You're not suggesting something that the owner's just going to go away and go, I just can't do that for whatever reason. So I think it's really our responsibility to make sure that the owners can adhere to the exercise programs that you're recommending. And again, as Katie said, that really is about every individual dog and every individual owner and what their situation is. So it's factoring in, and also for owners being really, really honest with their physio and their vet team about what they can achieve, because there's no point them saying, oh, I can definitely do that 5 times a day, no problem. And they go home and go, oh my God, I can't do that 5 times a day.
Yeah.
So, them being honest as well, because if they say to me, I can only do 1 exercise a day and I can do it twice, I know exactly which exercise I'm then going to choose to give them.
Right.
Rather, if someone says, actually, no, give me more, I can do much more, then I know that I can actually spread out and do, prescribe a few more exercises to them. So, working very much with your owners and your vet and your therapist team, and being very honest about what you've got available, and also, space in the house. What space have they got to be able to do home exercises in, and what equipment do they have? So we, on the CYC program, a lot of the equipment that we recommend is stuff that you can either source really easily, or stuff that you might have at home anyway. And so it's not asking people to go out and start buying loads of really expensive kit. And there's some brilliant kit out there that has its place and can be really, really useful. But it doesn't have to be all about, right now you need to go out and spend £100 on conditioning kit. There's stuff that you will have at home, or that you can easily purchase on the cheap. So, I mean, for instance, for sort of the pole groundwork exercises, we use guttering from B&Q, which costs about £5. So, that kind of thing is quite easy to access. So you're not necessarily suggesting with a home exercise program that someone's got to go and buy a whole agility setup at home.
Yeah, and they don't even have to be dog specific things, do they? They can be things that you would be using for your own exercises.
We use yoga blocks, we use half steps, we use matting. Bath mats are great because there tends to be a non-slip bottoms on them, so they're really good for proprioceptive input. So a range of household items. And actually, the more specific kit tends only to really come in when with the more high-level moving dogs generally, because they tend to be unstable pieces of kit and things like that, which you've got to be careful how you're using, particularly with a dog with compromised mobility. So there's a whole, and there are loads of exercise that we recommend as well that can be done without kit. So it doesn't always have to involve kit.
Yeah, and I guess when you're first starting the home exercise programs, you'll know if it's going to suit you and your dog. So you start doing those exercises and build on that, depending on how successful you are and how much your dog is enjoying it and gaining from it as well. So what would happen is you do your assessment, and then when you're starting the home exercise programs, like you say, you're looking at what people can achieve, what have they got time to do, and where would you start? Would you send then somebody home and say, let's do this for a week, and then we'll build on that? We'll see you back. How do you do it? Do you go through the exercises with with the owner and dog first?
Well, this is kind of where Conditioning Your Canine came from, because we realized with Kirsti and Alex as well, we realized as therapists working in clinic, the clinic environment and the therapy consult can be quite tight for time, and you've got so much stuff that you want to be able to achieve. And also for owners, sometimes it can be quite an emotional time as well. You might be giving some bad news. The dog hasn't progressed quite how we might have hoped, or it might have deteriorated a bit, or it might be a little bit more painful. So it can be quite an emotional time. And so we found that people were struggling to remember what had been recommended in clinic, and were going home and then coming back the next week and go, oh, well, I didn't quite remember what you said, and I didn't know how to do it right. So that's where Conditioning Your Canine really came from, was us as therapists finding that if we had a load of videos that we could then send people away with and say, these are the videos of how to do the exercises. They've got training tips in, they've got troubleshooting issues in, and they'll show you exactly what you need to do. That then made it so much easier for people to actually be able to go away and do them, and then come back the next week and go, well, I did this one really well, but I found that one really hard. Can we go through it? And you've got like a great place to start building from, rather than people just feeling a bit daunted and overwhelmed and not really knowing what they're supposed to be doing and how they're supposed to be doing it, because in the clinic you've got limited time to go through stuff properly.
Yeah. I mean, I was saying earlier, I really benefit from going to the physio. Then I forget, I think I've got those 4 exercises. Okay, I know those 2. I've forgotten the other 2. So actually having that email with the videos is really useful, just to trigger the memory. And so in that whole process, the exercise program, you're going to have a starting point. Is that sort of a warm up? Is that always going to be how does that happen? Is that always the same?
So things like warm up and cool down as part of your sort of your exercise program are something that can be integrated as part of the exercises that you would put together. And then it's about making a decision about what exercises need to come first, so that they would do that, sort of preparing the body for the challenges that are going to come through the rest of the program. So, for example, if you were going to do an exercise that was going to look at improving gait patterning, so maybe you were going to have a go with your cavaletti poles, what sort of exercises would I want to do in advance of doing that, so that my dog can really get the maximal benefit out of then completing the exercise? So maybe I would want to do something that helped them with their proprioception, something that improved their limb awareness, something that maybe helped them with their muscle recruitment, maybe something that helped them with their active range of motion. And then when you get on to doing your gait patterning exercise, you've tuned up and prepped all those other systems so that you can really drip feed the best quality of movement possible as you do the next bit of the exercise. So you help to gain every little bit of benefit out of your exercises, and you work in that warming up period as part of the exercise program. So it's not just picking a series of exercises, it's also what order you want people to do them in.
Absolutely. And some of the exercises are very much the priming prep exercises. I think we've got a slide with a dog paw on a bed in the images somewhere, which is a very good one for kind of priming the dog to load that limb correctly and think about where that limb is in space, which you might use really early on in your exercise program at the beginning, before you move on, as Katie said, to more sort of active exercises, which then build up on that.
And could you use, I mean, to me, it wouldn't make sense to go for a big walk or a run and then do your physio, but could you use your physio on your walk? So could you start your walk as your warm up and then start to do those exercises? Is that sometimes what the aim is?
Yeah, absolutely. So you can use, it doesn't have to be, hill walking and things like that in the right that are appropriate for the dog in question. Be a really helpful addition to a sort of conditioning or an exercise program. And certainly, using different surfaces, particularly if you've got a dog who maybe is quite compromised in their mobility and their walks are a bit boring and short, maybe finding places where you can go which have got different surfaces, so they can go and walk on, different surfaces, which is brilliant for proprioception. It's also more interesting for them. So definitely, you can do things out and about. And also doing things before you go out on the walk. So if your dog's been having a lovely snooze and you decide that it's time to go for a walk, they're getting straight out of their bed cold. What can you do then to try and make their movement on that walk as functional as possible? And that's part of the home exercise program as well. So we'll give exercises and exercise videos of, before you go for your walk, do this exercise with your dog, because it's going to get them thinking about moving their body in the most functional manner and set them up on that walk to move as well as they can.
Yeah. And that would be very dog specific, wouldn't it? Because like you said, some of these older, not even older, but some of these very arthritic dogs are only going for maybe a 10-minute walk. And so, yeah, doing something before maybe where you want to go. But if you've got a dog that's still going for an hour walk, then you do it in a different order, I guess, wouldn't you?
Absolutely. And there's so much you can do to prime that body to move correctly from the off, rather than them getting out of the bed and being a bit sort of stiff and a bit offloading a limb. And there's so much you can do at that point to make sure that then when they actually move, they're moving in as functional a way as they can.
Yeah. And especially if you're short of time, then you want it to be as effective as possible and do it in the right order. I mean, I think it is easy to forget, and I don't know why, because we wouldn't do it to ourselves, but warming up and cooling down, it's obvious that it's important, isn't it? But it's something that I think you just go for a walk and you're straight out and doing something very physical with your dog, and actually that's not going to be the best thing for them. So it comes back to that conditioning can be useful for every single dog.
I think as well, if you think about the sort of the cool down process, especially if you've done a program of exercises that's been maybe quite challenging, if you've been having all of this interaction and all this stimulation, and maybe there's been quite a lot of reward and they've been completing all of these challenges and tasks and getting all this positive reinforcement, if you just go, okay, stop, done now, how it's very difficult for that dog to then be able to be settled and relaxed and to be able to finish the program properly. Whereas if you build in maybe a few little things that just help to kind of bring them back down to baseline physically, but mentally as well, you can end that session in a much more positive way, so that they're then ready to rest and relax and actually take on and process a lot of the information that you've given them through asking them to complete those tasks in the first place. So part of them being able to get the benefit from the exercise is them also then being able to be a bit settled afterwards. And to be able to then take that on and really gain from it.
And for the musculoskeletal system as well, because obviously for muscles, it's not positive to go from quite, working those muscles in quite an intensive way to then just shutting them down. You need to actually cool those muscles off and stretch them off and relax that muscle tissue again back to a more resting state, rather than just leaving it in an active state and then going, right, done. It's not positive for the muscle fibers themselves.
Yeah. And how do you have tips of how to get dogs to do these exercises?
Yeah, so they're all built into the program. So each video has got like little training tips in there, and also kind of if this happens or if your dog offers this behavior instead, or you're not quite sure how to troubleshoot, little advice tips on how to common pitfalls that we see that tend to happen when you start training a dog or start a particular conditioning exercise with a dog. The common pitfalls that kind of come up. So that's all kind of built into the video, which is really helpful again for the owner, because it's one thing doing it perfectly in clinic and going, right, this is what you need to do. And then the owner goes away and gets home. It's like, oh, well, the dog's now doing this and they weren't doing that in clinic, but now they're offering me this. And I don't know quite how to get around that. So that's something that we focus on as well to help the home exercise program be as successful as it can be.
And it's got to be something the dog enjoys doing, hasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. But also, I think to give the owner some parameters of what is an example of doing the exercise well, and what's an example of maybe not having the right alignment or the right head positioning or whatever. So you start to give people these indicators of what good form actually is, what it looks like, so that then they're able to replicate it. And the more they're able to consistently replicate it, that's when you're going to start making changes to things like muscle engagement and retraining gait pattern and things like that. You need to have that consistency, and you can't have consistency if you don't have any parameters to work through. So the training tips are all supportive of that, but then some of the other documentation as well will give you indicators of how to look for that in static postures. So what should my dog look like when they're in a sit? What sort of thing we're looking for? What should they look like when they're in a stand? And if you are then aware of what it should look like, you can also keep an eye out for things like when your dog is starting to fatigue with their exercises. So, okay, this is good now. I can see that I've got correct alignment here, and my dog is doing this movement really well. This is really good quality. Okay, the next repetition actually didn't look like that. I'm starting to see that I'm losing my form. Now I can see that I'm actually starting to see signs of fatigue. I know where my finish point is.
Yeah.
So you can give people guidance in terms of, I would recommend that you would try and do this many sets and reps, but especially if you've got quite compromised mobility, you might find that the number of sets and reps they can do on a day-to-day basis might be quite variable.
Yeah.
If they're having a bad day with their arthritis, you can have quite a difference of what their capability is, sort of even sort of a few days to the next. And if you've got bigger gaps between your treatment sessions as well, if you're only seeing a dog at once a fortnight or once a month, through that there might be quite a lot of fluctuation. So if you empower your owners to be able to make these little assessments for themselves, then again they can really use that tool that you're giving them of that home exercise program to be as much of a positive influence as possible.
Yeah. So you're sort of reading what your dog is giving back to you, and then because you've got that backup on the videos and the exercise program, you're not going to push it. You're going to just adjust rather than wait for 2 weeks to see your physio again and then say, no, this isn't working for us. Yeah. There's obviously a plan and a backup. So if this happens, you do this. If this happens, carry on.
Yeah. And also all the exercises that we use and are very much our sort of way of working is about kind of consent-based rehab and consent-based training techniques. So you're very much working with the dog in their comfort level. And so you're not stressing the dog out at any point. You're not asking too much of the dog at any point. So the dog always feels comfortable and relaxed and engaged with the treatment plan is what we're really, really key about Conditioning Your Canine, is making sure that, you're not asking the dog too much. You're always setting it up to achieve. And you've got the dog in a happy and relaxed and engaged state, which obviously is so much nicer for everyone involved, the dog and the owner and the therapist, but also it's so much better for the musculoskeletal system and the brain, because a dog that's in a stressed state is not in a position for learning. It's not in a position for taking on new information. The proprioceptive system is much more shut down. So you haven't got a dog that's actually going to achieve in its exercise program if you're forcing something on it or it's feeling stressed out. Yeah. So that's something that we really emphasize, is the dog being engaged and happy and relaxed in its training program. And if for any reason it isn't, then you need to stop and reevaluate why. Maybe you've pushed a bit too fast, maybe you've asked a bit too much, but you need to back off and get to the point where the dog's actually like, oh no, I want to do this. I want to do this exercise with you, rather than you doing something to the dog or asking the dog to do something that it feels uncomfortable with.
So would you be using things like treats or toys, or just finding that thing that makes your dog tick to encourage them to do their movements or whatever you want them to do?
And there's quite a lot in, we've got a document in as part of the program called the Foundations, which runs through kind of the foundations of a training program, how to actually implement it safely, how to implement it ethically for your dog. And there's a lot in there about, treat placement, and actually where you give the reward is very important, because if you have, if you've got a dog with neck pain, you don't want to be giving the reward so high that they're having to stretch up for it, because that could flare up the neck pain. So, really thinking about, and also then you change the form of the body as well. So there's information in there about, how you use your reward is as important as using one, but definitely it's very much reward and positive reinforcement based.
Mm. And do you encourage your owners to keep a diary, or to document how it's going, to feed back to you as well, just so that you can tweak and change things? How do you want your feedback to be?
And we'll often get owners to video, so that can work. I mean, everyone pretty much is on a smartphone now, so you can people can take videos at home, or they can get a friend or a partner to do videos for them. So we'll often get videos, or even just photos. Still photos can tell you a huge amount as well. So we'll often get video feedback on the exercises and how they're doing at home, and that can be really useful as well, because then you can sort of see, actually what you're using at home isn't quite right. You probably want to use this instead, or you're set up in the area, because things like if you're using a block or something for a dog to stand on, you want to make sure that the area around that block is non-slip, so that if the dog does step off, they're not going to slip. So all that kind of thing. So video feedback from the owner is just as useful as us giving videos to the owner in many ways.
Yeah. So when you start the canine conditioning, how often would you, a couple of things here really. So I'm talking about mainly arthritic dogs. What would be your main goals? So if you have an arthritic dog that comes to you and you can, it's obviously going to vary depending on where the arthritis is causing a problem. But what are your goals of the canine condition, of conditioning the dog who already has a joint condition? Are we trying to improve posture? Are we trying to gain muscle mass? Are we trying to what are the things that your main goals for conditioning in an arthritic dog?
So I think basically all of the above. You're looking to optimize their posture and their movement and make them as functional and efficient as they're capable of being. So you want to try and have a positive influence on how they hold themselves, so that you've got more correct muscle engagement. You want to help them to have their limbs in correct alignment, so that you're not overly stressing joints under angles that they shouldn't be at, and other sort of structures, that sort of supporting structures, because you've got maybe hyperextension, or they've got elbows poked out or turned in. You want to help them to switch on those postural muscles which help them to support themselves, and you want to try and help improve their ability to transition themselves from the different postures that they might adopt during the day. So helping them to be as efficient and functional from lying down to standing up as possible, and try and maintain that independence for as long as possible. So you help them with their limb awareness, so that they know how to bring their legs in properly. Maybe you use some supportive techniques so that they can really engage their extensor musculature in their hind limb, so that they can start to retrain a good push up. And then once you've started to help that movement pattern just to get organized, then you can work on strengthening it a bit, and hopefully you allow them to be a bit more independent in that movement. Sit to stand is something that we will often work on, because you're moving through that squat position, which is so important for maintaining independent toileting. So these sort of really important functional movements that allow the dog to still have independence and quality of life. And those are all the little systems that we're going to try and tune into. And with your home exercise program, you've got so many opportunities to have that little positive influence, and you can have it on such a regular basis. So if you've got your owner enthusiastic and all jazzed up about doing their home exercise programs, you might be able to have that positive therapeutic influence on the dog every single day, maybe a couple of times a day. And we can't cure what's going on with the disease process with arthritis. So our best way of managing it is to try and kind of tick away at all of these things that do damage and put some positive back in instead. So yeah, absolutely, we would look at trying to influence the best possible posture that dog can have, the best gait pattern that dog can offer, try and help them with their proprioception, so they're going to be less likely to have slips and trips and stumbles, try and help them with their muscle recruitment. And then if you've got that engaged in a correct and balanced way, then you can start looking at strengthening and muscle mass and supporting those joints better, and their joint range of motion. And again, probably we would look at doing something like an active or an active facilitated sort of an action in that situation, so that if you've got a joint that is a bit creaky or a bit sore, you put the dog in charge of how much range they're going to offer you, and you just keep them safe when they're out of that clinical environment where you're supervising. So those are the sorts of things that we would try and influence with our home exercises. And if you could tweak every single one of those things in a small way each day, you've got a really good opportunity to start making some significant changes in how that dog is managing day to day, and potentially sort of get to the point where you're stabilizing the disease a little bit. You're having a few less trips and stumbles, you're having less flare-ups. Maybe you've got an opportunity to increase their exercise a little bit, because they're actually a bit more tolerant of exercise because they're moving that much more efficiently. Maybe under veterinary supervision, they're able to review medication. Potentially they actually, because they're not so sore anymore, they don't need to be on so much meds, and that gives you a bit more wiggle room sort of as and when you need it. So lots of sort of chances to play a huge role in the management strategy for an arthritis case.
And I think it's Sorry, as Katie mentioned at the beginning, it's also the recruitment of those postural muscles and the deep stabilizing muscles that are so important, and that go really. We know that multifidus can atrophy really quickly in sort of disease and especially with things like OA in terms of functional movement. So actually recruiting those deep stabilizer muscles, it's not just necessarily about the big movement muscles, but the stabilizers that are actually going to keep the rest of the dog safe and moving in a functional manner, and it's little movements that you need to focus on to get those muscles switched on and moving. It's not necessarily big actions. So it's getting those muscles switched back on again and working as they should, so that the functional movement of the dog, as Katie said, being able to squat to toilet, being able to get themselves up out of their bed, they're actually using their core in a really functional way. And then the load is taken off the joints because they're able to move themselves with their core rather than hauling up on sort of potentially sore elbows or something like that.
Yeah. So we're not looking for massive results, are we? We're just looking at tweaking, like you said, just tweaking lots of little things just to help keep that independence and comfort, really improve comfort. Did you want to share your slides at all?
Yeah, we can certainly have a look at them. They're sort of relating to various different things that we've talked about. So, I don't know, Katie, if you want to start with some of your slides now.
That's yours.
This is one of Cam's lovely flowcharts, and I just kind of had this one in here because when we were talking about arthritis and sort of the role of the home exercise program for an arthritic dog, I just thought that this showed really nicely how you do have a bit of a downward spiral when you're dealing with arthritis, and there is this kind of slightly depressing progressive nature to it, but the home exercise program is your opportunity to start to try and turn the tide there a little bit.
Yeah, slow it right down.
You can start to counteract some of these systems that have started to go wrong. So one of the sort of specific examples that I just kind of picked as one to kind of look at as a single effect was if we just take the proprioceptive system, for example. So that sort of body awareness system where you've got joint damage affecting the mechanoreceptors, you're not getting that feedback back to the dogs about where they're placing their feet. So you've got more trips and stumbles, your movement becomes less efficient and less balanced, your muscle recruitment is less effective, muscle mass and tone starts to reduce, and your joints are less supported and stable and less able to absorb shock. So that's just looking at one single factor, and you can really see how that spiral starts to take on.
Yeah.
But
as fast, it just accelerates as well, doesn't it? It's quite slow to start with, and then
absolutely. But if we looked at examples of proprioceptive exercises, so where you could start putting some of that sort of positive back in again, you can have positive proprioceptive input through the paws with things like sensory mats, all bits and bobs that you might just have around in your house, so you can pull together any sort of collection of textured mats that you've got, and you can start to actually have a positive input coming back in again there. You can use touch techniques to help with limb awareness. You can use things like visual aids. So where Nikki was talking about the guttering to be used as round poles, you can also line it up so that you use it as a corridor, and just help a little bit with finding alignment again. You can use those ground poles in a sort of a cavaletti setup so that you're looking at helping with gait patterning, active range of motion, limb awareness. And then you can look at how can you help that dog find their sort of optimal posture and just do a little bit of gentle weight shifting so that you start to switch on and engage these stabilizing muscles, as Nikki was saying, but also so that you're kind of stimulating those mechanoreceptors in a way that is appropriate so that the dog can start remapping where their limbs and where their bodies are again. So I just thought that this was potentially a good way to maybe almost have a bit of a sort of a hopeful look about managing arthritis, because you do have so many opportunities when it comes to your home exercise program to have such a positive influence on the body in between treatments.
I was wondering if I could just pop this question up here at this point, because we just talked a little bit about it from Tracy about we're talking about the guttering, and Luke said he uses vacuum pipes for his pole work. So just, you've kind of just talked about it a little bit, but pole work is using, do you want to just go through what you just said again about the cavalettis and also about using the poles to do the pathways and that kind of thing?
So cavaletti, usually you're talking about setting up a series of ground poles to step over so that you can encourage a correct walk, a correct gait pattern as they go through that series of poles. So one of the sort of the compensatory things that you will see quite often when movement has started to be compromised is you might notice that a dog paces, or that they don't put together that 4-beat walk in the way that they should do. So they can swing both the front and the hind limb of one side through and then the other side, or they can kind of shuffle themselves along and not particularly have much of a pattern going on at all. And it's one way that you can help to retrain that correct organization of steps as they move in walk. It's one way to sort of influence that pattern. So that's one of the things that it gets used for an awful lot.
Yeah, I find a lot of dogs with the arthritic dogs, they start to have quite worn down nails where they're just kind of scuffing a little bit when they're walking. And I think it's because it hurts and they don't want to lift the foot up properly. But that kind of work would encourage them, wouldn't it, to engage and to lift and properly place, which is what you were talking about with proprioception. It's just being more aware of where your feet are.
Yeah, I think there's something to be said though as well for making sure that your dog is capable of what you're asking them to do. So we wouldn't necessarily use cavaletti for all dogs, especially if they had very low limb flight and they were very restricted in their joints. And it might be something that you build up to once your dog is more comfortable and they're able to offer you more available active range of motion. And if you feel like actually maybe they need a bit more help to be comfortable as well. So assessing that sort of level of discomfort and making a decision about maybe do we need to send you back to the vet to have a little review and see whether there's some more pain management that we need to have on board. What other things can we put into your therapy sessions maybe that help to top you up with pain relief? So maybe use of electrotherapies, maybe particular massage techniques and things, just to make the availability of those movements and even getting into those corrected postures something that is more viable, something that you can actually ask of your dog.
And sometimes increasing or adding in pain relief, it doesn't mean it's a permanent fixture. It can just be to make you more comfortable to achieve things that can then help you in long term reduce those again, reduce the things that you're going to have to, the pain relief that you may be having to give.
Absolutely, like a window of opportunity to be able to re-engage particular muscle patterns so that you're then strong enough to hold yourself better so that then you can have better active range of motion. It's not necessary. I think that's something that some owners get quite anxious about is if you do have to go down the route of, I think maybe we need a little bit more help to make sure that your dog is comfortable. They may be anxious that once they're on this medication, it's never going to, they're never going to come off it again. And maybe in some cases that's true, but in some cases you can, particularly if you use your home exercise program well, if you really use that as a tool, you can use that as a window of opportunity to make the improvements so that the dog doesn't actually need that pain relief to stay comfortable anymore. And maybe they can be phased down onto a lower dosage or off, depending on what the vet thinks is appropriate.
And I think that's the really exciting thing with arthritis is that there isn't just a prescriptive, this is what happens. So we're going to add this, then we're going to do this, then we'll add the physio, then we'll do the hydro, then we'll do the massage. And it's not something that is going to be the same with every dog. And you can change things that you are doing, you may not need to do, and you're going to replace it with something else. And it is, I think people do get anxious, you're right. And they think, oh, he's now on 2 lots of pain relief and we're having to do the acupuncture and we're having to do this. But then things will change because you're improving and you can swap things around again. And it's just constantly evolving. So you should never be too hard or too anxious about these things, as nothing has to be permanent.
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah.
Did you have any other slides that you wanted to go on from there?
Not from there. I think with the slides, we kind of we just got chatting, and we were going to pop them up in strategic places.
That's fine. That's fine. You just let me know if you wanted to put anything up.
I've got a couple on mine that I can just talk through, which are relevant to kind of things that we were talking about earlier. If you want to just pop a couple of mine up and I can talk through. Yeah. So this is kind of relating to appropriate equipment and why equipment can be really useful, but doesn't have to be fancy. So this is the lovely Leela, who is a very functional, very talented little dog. And she's in a lot of our videos with Alex, doing amazing things on the.
Is she one of your dogs? Does she belong to
Alex? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. She's a canine exercise rehabilitation specialist and a massage therapist. And she's part of our team at CYC. And she's in a lot of the videos because she's very clever at dog training and positive reinforcement and all that kind of thing. So she's in a lot of the videos showing how to do the exercises in a really safe and ethical way. So this is her dog Leela, and this is showing that, you know, she's doing quite a light movement here, which is just a baited head turn. But because Leela is foot targeted onto the pads, Leela knows that the aim of the exercise is for her to move her head and engage her core, rather than if she was standing on a flat surface, just on the floor, she'd be tempted to move her feet along with the treat. But because she knows that she gets reward for keeping her feet on the blocks, she's not going to step off. She's actually going to use her core and move her head. So you're getting a net range of motion, and you're getting core engagement, and you're getting a lot of proprioceptive input. So something that's quite simple with quite basic equipment actually does a huge amount. So that was sort of demonstrating that.
And makes the task really, really clear to her.
Yeah.
Sometimes having a little bit of equipment that doesn't, exactly like Nikki says, doesn't have to be fancy, doesn't have to be expensive, but it just helps to give some parameters to what actually you're asking them to do. Sometimes not having any kit at all, it can be quite hard to then help your dog to understand what you want from them.
Yeah, so she knows this is what's going to happen.
Yeah. The next slide along, I think, is showing something a bit similar, but
you'll need to just do that on your
one. Do I do it?
Yeah.
How do I just go along? Oh, here we are. Oh, fab.
There you go.
Brilliant. So this is very much what we were talking about priming your dog for movement before you go somewhere. So this is pretty much without equipment. We have got a mat down, which is giving proprioceptive input into the limb, into the pad. But you could do this with a bath mat or anything like, you know, not nice and non-slip and that's giving loads of feedback, or a doormat at home. And this is about priming the dog to actually use and ground the limb. So particularly if you have a dog who might be sort of just slightly up on a toe, not wanting to quite ground that limb into the ground, proprioceptively, you want to re-establish that pathway of actually correctly placing that limb, particularly if you've got on top of the pain issues. So the limb is no longer painful, but potentially you've got some tissue shortening, you've got a habituated gait pattern in there, which is incorrect, and you need to work around that. And actually adding some proprioceptive input manually and just gently grounding that pad can help reprogram that neural pathway of actually this limb needs to be placed in this manner rather than up on a toe and less functional. And with the flexor pattern engaged, you're actually engaging more of an extensor pattern for the limb to come down onto the ground. So this is one of the kind of exercises that we might recommend before you went out on a walk, because you're actually setting your dog up to move functionally on that walk.
And how many times do you find that, and obviously it won't be a set answer, but how many times do you have to do this for the dog to then remember or to start to use that leg in a better way, do you find?
It really depends on the dog. The owners certainly report that they really notice a difference. If they do, we've got a couple of weight shifting and grounding exercises that we'll often recommend before, you know, when a dog gets up out of bed, ready to go out for a walk, do these priming exercises, prime the limb extensors, prime the proprioceptive input of the paw correctly grounding, and prime the weight shifting, and then you're recruiting the deep stabilizer muscles as well. And owners will often report, oh, well, they did move much better after that, you know, after you do that. So with some of our arthritic cases, it will be before every walk that we would recommend. It only takes a couple of minutes. The dog gets used to what you're doing and understands the process.
Yeah.
And it's just part of your routine of going out for a walk, a bit like putting on a harness or, getting your treats. You do this as well. And it's almost, it's a cumulative thing. But with some of our cases, we would recommend it pretty much every time.
Right.
And I think it's about having that sort of that ongoing trickle-fed influence.
Yeah.
So the just topping up on a regular basis. So it's not about volume. It's not about doing it for hours and hours and spending a long time doing each of these things. It's just giving the body a little bit of information about where they should be and what is correct and what sort of placement you would like and what you want to start retraining as what the body recognizes as normal, rather than the sort of the maybe the compensatory pattern that they've had in place, so that you can start to retrain and start to propagate those correct movements, rather than start always having that sort of default coming through.
And it sounds like something so small, doesn't it? But if you're doing it as part of a routine every day, then it can evidently make quite a big difference.
Yeah, huge difference. And actually doing little and often is often much better for the dog. It's often something that owners find that it's really achievable. It's not, you don't have to set aside half an hour to do a really in-depth training program. You can just add these little exercises into your day. And that's actually a really nice, stress-free, easy way to do it, rather than putting loads of expectation on yourself, putting loads of expectation on the dog, and then actually setting both of you up to fail because the dog gets freaked out because you're all kind of intense and really sort of going for it. Whereas just adding these little things in here and there can be, are actually better often. Yeah.
Do you have another slide?
I think that's probably the most useful two of mine for me. Yeah.
So I was just going to go back to over here. There's a couple of questions about certain issues. Are there any conditions where canine conditioning would not be appropriate? So we have one, like for example, here with cruciate disease or sacral disease, spondylosis. Is there something that you could do for every dog? Would there be any dog that you would say, you know what, no, conditioning is not?
I haven't come across one. I think obviously as therapists, we're always working under veterinary referral. So we're working closely with the vet. We get the vet history of the dog before we see the dog. So we know exactly what's gone on. And it's always about making everything as appropriate as possible for that dog. So there are absolutely some exercises that I would not give to a dog with those diagnoses. And I think would be inappropriate, but there would be something that we could do. Yeah.
So it's definitely worth talking. And if people wanted to go ahead and do some conditioning for their dog, it's not something that every physiotherapist would offer, is it? Because we classically think physiotherapy for arthritis is about the sessions that you're doing in the clinic or when the physio comes to your house. So canine conditioning is a different thing, isn't it? It's not.
And there are people who are, very high. Alex and Kirsti are both very highly qualified in exercise prescription and canine conditioning. So there are certainly people who have it as a speciality skill as well, and as that knowledge base. But CYC is a support that therapists can sign up for. So therapists can use it with their owners. So it gives the therapist the opportunity to use that resource as well with their patients, and know that the exercises that are on there are all, as we say, ethical and very much about positive reinforcement, consent-based rehab and safety for the dog. So that it's a supportive tool, not just for owners, but for the therapists who are actually prescribing the exercises.
It is also up to it's also up to the therapist to make an appropriate clinical assessment and clinical judgment about what sort of exercises are appropriate. So it's not just any selection of exercises that you fancy and put together. You need an appropriate professional to be able to make a judgment call about these things, and then put together a home exercise program that is of benefit and that is safe and appropriate for that dog.
So for instance, we don't have in Conditioning Your Canine, we don't have this is our cruciate rehab program, because what's suitable for one dog in cruciate ligament rehab might be completely inappropriate for another. So we don't have an OA program or an elbow dysplasia program, because it's all about what's that dog's individual challenges and aims, and sometimes even on that day, in that week, they're going to change.
Yeah. So your Conditioning Your Canine is a service that other therapists can use,
Exactly.
and they would then choose what they wanted to use out of it for your pet.
Yeah.
So if anyone then wanted to do something like that and use the home exercise programs, could they then go to their physiotherapist and say, can you contact?
Yeah.
So we'll put the link in
your canine, and then you've got all the exercises. Yeah, exactly. Ready to go. Yeah.
So we'll put the link in the live. So if people want to, I mean, we get lots of physiotherapists and hydrotherapists watching as well. So it will be there if you're interested in learning more about that.
And we're a super friendly team. We're here all the time, 24/7, much to our detriment. So if you've got any questions, or there's an email address and a phone number, which is Kirsti is our sort of main contact on that kind of stuff, and she's always happy to chat to people about canine conditioning and how we can help, and what support we can give. So
it's just an extra thing, an extra tool that people can use for your arthritic dogs. I've got one from Tracy here. There's a little question here. My dog does not enjoy hydrotherapy. Is this reason enough to stop, or do the benefits outweigh her lack of enthusiasm? Well, what I would say to that kind of thing is, if I don't know how you feel about this, but I know, Nikki, you do still do hydrotherapy, don't you, as well? But potentially using something that you can do at home, rather than if your dog's not enjoying the hydrotherapy and you don't feel as an owner that they're getting much out of it, maybe you want to be doing some more things at home.
Yeah, I think it comes back around to what we were discussing earlier about positive reinforcement and consent-based rehab, is that if you've got a dog who is stressed out and is worried and anxious about their whatever activity they're being asked to perform, you actually, as well as it not being great for the dog and not great for the owner to be involved in, and the therapist as well, you don't want to have to work with a dog that's stressed out, you're actually not in the best position. The dog isn't in the best position for learning, so they're in a bit more of a fight and flight state. You've got a lot of negative, you get a cascade of hormones throughout the body when the dog goes into fight and flight mode, which are actually really negative. They inhibit learning, which is why people who have stressful situations often don't remember, because actually their fight and flight mechanism has kicked in so much that they haven't actually laid down those memories. And it also releases cortisol, which we know is very negative for protein synthesis and the musculoskeletal system. So if you do have a dog that is very, and I don't know with this particular dog, maybe it's just a bit of a dislike, not quite happy, or is it actually the dog is genuinely quite stressed by this activity? That's the call that the therapist and the owner need to make together. And there have been, a number of dogs that we've said, this isn't right for them. We're going to do land-based. We're going to do a really good home exercise program. We're going to use our massage techniques, our electrotherapies, and we're not going to bother about the hydrotherapy because it's just not right for that dog, not necessarily physically, but mentally and emotionally.
Yeah, and Lynn's just put here about another point there is coming up. Quite a lot of owners of dogs who are really fearful of vet visits worry that physio or conditioning may be too hands-on for their dogs. Is there anything that can be said to reassure them? I don't know how you feel about that, but obviously the home exercise programs avoid any of that. So,
if there is touch, it would be very much owner-led and dog-led, and very much working with the dog to find a touch that was acceptable and okay for them to deal with, and building up that touch slowly. So that, if a dog doesn't like its paws being touched, you're not going to go straight in and recommend like the grounding exercise I showed in the slide, because that's just going to worry the dog in question. So conditioning can be quite hands off, conditioning exercises, and they can. And the same with physio, there are techniques that we can use. We've had dogs come into clinic that we haven't been able to get hands on because of behavioural issues and the dog being very fearful. So you just have to use different things in your toolbox to get that physio. So I think people often think of physio as in, you go to the physio and they do something and it really hurts and they tell you just to take a few deep breaths and get on with it. As canine physios, we don't tend to work like that, because you're working with a completely different species with completely different behavioural patterns. So you've got to be very mindful of that. And I think that's why, human physio and canine physio can be quite different in their techniques that are used, because some things that you might do to a person, you can't do to a dog.
No, absolutely. And also, people are the ones that are bringing their dogs to the physiotherapist. So if they see their dog have a really bad experience, number one, they're not going to come back, but they're also not going to be positive to other people about that either. So nobody's going to force the dog into things that they're not going to enjoy. It's not good for the dog. It's not good for business. It's not good for the client. So
and you're not going to get a result if you got, if a dog comes in and you lose its trust within the first sort of 5-10 minutes of a consult, you're not going to get any result from the therapy. So
no. I don't really know what this means, but I'm going to pop it up because you probably will. Luba says, what are your thoughts on sit pretty for dogs with hip dysplasia? Any thoughts?
It's not an exercise that we have on our platform very deliberately, and it's not an exercise that we would recommend.
There we go. I hope that answers your question there, Luba. I try and make sure that we're just putting everything on there. Will your canine conditioning link be accessible to vets or physios only?
That's something. I mean, we launched the kind of very much to the physiotherapy industry, canine physiotherapy industry in October of this year, and that's last year. Yes, and that's very much been our target. I think it would be really interesting to explore that with vet practices and how that could work with vets. Actually, that would be an interesting place for the platform to go. And as I say, it grew from being this idea that we had to make our lives and our owners' lives easier in practice into something much bigger, where we realized that if we found it useful, other therapists would too. So it's always sort of growing and evolving, and we're in the process actually of putting up about another 5 or 10 exercises, so it's always developing. So I mean, that'd be something that would be interesting to talk to vet clinics as to whether it would be a useful tool for vets as well to use after when they've seen a dog post surgery or arthritic case or anything like that as well.
I think it would be brilliant, and I think it would certainly have a part to play in, like you just said, referral places where they have a lot more time and they're doing a lot of post-operative care things anyway. There's always a problem in veterinary practices with time issues, but it's a brilliant resource, and certainly my feeling is that we are using physiotherapists far more frequently when we can find them, because they're in short demand as well. Not short demand, there aren't enough of them to refer to. But certainly I would be wanting to send every dog, every young dog that comes in, I would love them to do something like that, some conditioning, and just to try and prevent these horrendous issues that we have in older arthritic dogs, where people look back, and we see this a lot on Holly's Army as well, with people that have an arthritic dog that are struggling, and then when they get a new dog, they want to know immediately, what can I do to change what happened with my previous dog? And this is one of the things that you can do. Start off as you mean to go on, and just because you've got a young dog that is fit, healthy, like we said at the beginning, does not mean that they shouldn't have extra things that they can do to try and help condition them.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's so key.
And I think
it's exciting that we're starting to move towards that. And I've got owners who bring their older arthritic dogs to me who say, "Oh, I've got a puppy and he's 6 months old, and when would you be able to see him?" And it's brilliant that it's starting to move towards that, and hopefully we can future-proof this generation of puppies coming through now, that against a lot of the issues that maybe 7-8 years ago, that it just wasn't as mainstream as it is now.
And this arthritis is still going to be an issue. It's still many dogs are still going to get arthritis. It's not going to stop the arthritis happening, but it's going to mean that dogs are fitter and able to manage it, and hopefully live a lot longer than without something like this. So
absolutely.
And maybe without the same degree of disease process by set ages. So maybe if they've managed to use themselves as balanced and efficiently and maintain their muscle mass and their recruitment for so much longer, and their sort of default postures are more correct, then they won't have put as much wear on their joints.
No, less abnormal pressure.
These hopefully absolutely crippled dogs at some of these early ages that we still see at the moment.
No, it's a really, really positive thing. If anyone else has any more questions, please do keep asking. People will watch this later, and probably put questions on there. So I will check again tomorrow for questions over the next couple of days, and get back to Nikki and Katie if there's anything specific that we need an answer to. But thank you so much, both of you, for coming on. I'm going to put the link to Canine Conditioning Your Canine into the Facebook Live as well, and it'll be on YouTube. So yeah, thank you so much, ladies, for joining us.
Thank you.
Should also just mention Big Barker as well, because they are sponsoring a lot of our lives at the moment as well. So thank you so much for that. They have competitions. There's competition on the CAM Facebook page as usual, where you can win one of the Big Barker beds, which are fantastic. So do have a look at that. Thank you to them, and thank you, Nikki. Thank you, Katie.
Thank you so much.
Very much.
Thanks.
Have a good evening, everyone. Take care. Bye.
Bye.